This is the London Fintech podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London Fintech Podcast, episode 39, and I am pleased to be taking a break from talking to the biggest players in London Fintech and dive instead into the far more numerous, if lower profile, world of small fintechs. Given the outburst of tech and business creativity right now, there have been plenty of new and young companies forming in this sector, both from the fin side and the tech side of the fintech phenomenon. It's admirable that so many folks are foregoing the wage slavery and potential necessity to be a clone to fit into a giant FS or IT firm and starting out on their own. Equally, as all the stats show, it's a highly risky path, with the vast majority falling by the wayside. How do startup and small fintechs alter the odds? What's it like working at the smaller end of the fintech ecosystem? I'm delighted to be joined to discuss this topic by Alexandre Gaillard. He is uniquely qualified to talk about this topic, being the founder and CEO of a small fintech, Inves, and the founder of the Swiss fintech organisation. Inves is an automated, intelligent financial information platform enabling wealth managers and professional investors to navigate through clients' investments, compliance and investment convictions. And we look forward to hearing what that is later in the show. Above and beyond all of these plaudits, however, Alexandre is a long-standing fan of the podcast, clearly a man of style and substance, so I look forward to lots of praise and grovelling. And well, if that doesn't come, you know how easy it is to cut and paste when audio editing. He recently tweeted that he enjoys listening to the podcast when cooking, something I thought a little odd. Wouldn't it curdle the vichyssoise? But my partner thought it was a lovely idea. It did rather get me wondering what all you listeners do when you listen to the podcasts. But maybe I don't really want to know. Plenty to talk about, so let's go on with the show. Hi Alexander, thanks for joining me today.
Hello Mike, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me today. It's actually, the reality is that I'm not only listening to you while I'm cooking, I'm also listening to you most of the time while I'm jogging. And I've been listening to you in San Francisco, in London, in Hong Kong, wherever the fintech adventure dragged me to. And it's a pleasure to be on the show today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I've listened to podcasts myself for many years, probably 5 years plus, and mainly I've listened to them in the car. But the craziest story I've heard so far about people listening to the London Fintech podcast was one chap who's in a fintech in London, should remain nameless, was listening to me while walking around the outback in Australia. A very incongruous place to be thinking about the challenges of fintech. So tell me, what brings you into working in a small fintech yourself, and what's that like compared to having a proper job?
Well, I've been working 12 years in a hedge fund, in a private banks, and even for Bank of China. And I don't know, it's different when you have your own agenda and you're going for a new adventure. I'm lucky, and we're trying now to change the way advice is given to clients. So that's the story of Inves. I mean, I was based in Switzerland. There was no meetup. Meetup was a word that didn't exist in Geneva or Zurich at this time.
When did you leave conventional employment and found Inves?
Conventional employment left me, I should say, like a lot of people from the fintech industry about 2 years ago. And I started Inves in 2014.
I was remembering myself when I left large employment, which by this stage was 55,000 people in it, and started on my own in 1998 when there was just me. And it's interesting how the mind has various habits. So I remember one evening, after a particularly challenging day, I was going home on the train and I had a sort of thought, which no doubt I habitually had for many decades before that. And I was looking out the window, and I remember thinking, those people at work, it's all their fault. And I thought, and actually then I saw my reflection in the window and I thought, those people at work, it's just you, Mike. It must be just all your fault. So it's interesting how there sort of can be various lags in some of the neurons in the brain in terms of the cultural adjustment that it takes. It sort of slowly sinks into the bones what you've really done.
Sure, but probably, Mike, I already had a soul of an entrepreneur. So it was also for me, to start something really creative. And unfortunately, as you know, most banks don't offer you too much this slack of creativeness.
Yes, they've been turning more and more into machines. When I started in the city in 85, they wanted creative, what we might call in modern words, entrepreneurial people who just get up and start stuff and all that kind of thing. But it's gradually changed over the years. And in English, there's this expression, sorting the sheep from the goats out. I'm never quite sure what it means. But certainly speaking for myself and many other people I know in fintech world, really they are sort of life's goats, and sometimes they try and be sheep and pretend they're a sheep, and you can try and stand in the middle of a pack of sheep and have an easy life, but before you know it, you're on the outside making a different sound, and you think, oh, I'm a goat again. So you're busy being a goat. And in terms of being very kind and helping the fintech community, I spend a lot of time doing the podcast, of course, for the love of it and helping the community. And as you say, the Swiss fintech organization that you've created is something you do for the love and helping the community. So how's that going?
The Swiss Fintech Association is going well. So the idea of the Swiss Fintech Association was to gather 2 meetups originally. One meetup in Zurich with more than 700 members, and another one in Geneva that started about 18 months ago with 560 members now.
Wow.
And we gathered the 2 meetups together, and we have more than 2,000 people now following the movement, and already 200 people sign up to become paying members for 2016. So it's free if you join for 2015, and in 2016 individuals will be able to join the association. This is a bit something specific about the association. You cannot become a member. I mean, you can support as a company, but companies are more like supporters than active members. And why do we do this? We do this because as an individual, you can give your point of view in a more freely way than if you're working for one of those big banks. So that's a very specific format of the association.
I see, that's very interesting, and it's interesting that you're building in a revenue model. At the beginning, I mean, too much of the sort of fintech phenomenon and probably silly things like this podcast have been built on the kind of Y2K tech boom, which is, let's just build something. Don't worry about revenue, that's old hat. Whereas, as we all know, when we go to the supermarket, they still ask for money, no matter how old hat it is. So it's good to have the revenue there. Now, for those of us that don't understand Switzerland very well, it is a beautiful place. It's got real weather, as I feel, compared to England, and it's got clean streets, and it's been dealing with money for a long time. It's got the reputation also of being a very conservative place. So how does this whole sort of stasis versus change, traditional FS versus new FS dance work over there? I was quite surprised and impressed that the thousands of people are into Swiss fintech as such.
Of course, well, everyone knows bank secrecy was one of the value added of the banking system, and most banking systems were not meant to be opened. So no sandbox, no open APIs, no communication whatsoever like you have in the UK or in the US. Of course, the mindset now is shifting very quickly because the added value also is shifting very quickly. I like to give the parallel with carbon copies and typing machines, People used to type with the machine and with carbon copies, and this were the added value. Today you have printers. So you have to tell to all those people where the new added value will be, and you have to help them in translating their old job into the new job. To put it back to the banking industry, is a bit like the end of the cashier business and the ATMs appearing in the private banking in Switzerland.
Yes, I guess it's a delusion from outside Switzerland that Switzerland being conservative means that it doesn't change. I mean, if you look at sort of how successful it has been doing sensible things like not being involved in all the zillion wars of the last few centuries and changing with all, telegraph and telephones and computers and everything, actually Switzerland has done a very good job of changing throughout in its own unique way.
Sure, Swiss people prefer to do it right than to try 10 times and be wrong 10 times. That's the way we do.
It's an interesting approach, and I think it's a conversation I'd like to have one day on the podcast, a subject I've touched on before, which is what would a European fintech vibe be like compared to, for example, an American one?
Sure, I think the European style is much more of a East Coast fintech model than a West Coast fintech model. The West Coast is more having big dreams with freemium models, and then you start the mock-up, you start developing, you get millions of fundings, and then after you wonder if all you do is compliant or not with the regulator. Whereas the East Coast style is definitely first you start with the regulation, then you start with the user experience, and then you start looking for funding to start your company.
That's an interesting distinction I hadn't heard before. And briefly, before we move on to small fintechs, how would you characterize in terms of the West Coast and East Coast of Switzerland, otherwise known as Geneva and Zurich? Do they have any sort of distinctions in their approach? I mean, obviously, and again, for those people who are a long way from Switzerland and don't really realise it, the west part of Switzerland is, quotes, pretty French, and the East Coast is pretty German.
Yes, well, Switzerland is an 8 million people country with 4 languages and very distinctive cultures. Even in the German part, if you're from Bern, Basel or Zurich, you won't speak exactly the same German. For the western part, the French-speaking part is a bit easier. The specificities of the two are about the same. People are trying to create some marketing stuff with the Bitcoin Valley, but in the reality, you will find very similar type of companies, fintech companies in Switzerland. However, even if I'm the vice president of the Swiss Fintech Association, I have to tell you that fintech don't really exist yet in Switzerland. There's nothing like large ecosystems. It's still very complex, costly, and often not very transparent to get connected to core banking systems or to core payment systems. And this is why Swiss small fintech companies are, for most of them, struggling to start being very successful. But things are changing very, very fast. And we have to encourage also those new incubators and those new entrepreneurs, my friends that are trying hard to push their companies to break even and then to be successful.
Interesting, and that's a nice lead into the world of small and startup fintech. So I guess there's probably three main phases in fintech, which is that you start your fintech, you build a product, and then you grow it, you market it, you sell it, and you scale operationally, and at which point you're off the runway and flying and just trying to get more altitude. So starting with the starting, the obvious question, which I know the answer to myself, having been an independent consultant for 17 years, but I'll ask it in the fintech context of you, which is that, do you have to be crazy to start a fintech?
Yes, you have to be crazy to start a company first. You must have faith in the reason why you're building a product, because money is taking a lot of time before it hits your bank account. Of course, you have to create a product, then you have to push it, to publicize it, to convince the client, you have to plug it to their core banking systems. And as you can imagine, most bankers, classical bankers, again, this is very much for the B2B solutions in the fintech, are not so much used to select technological solutions. Most of them, they have a Bloomberg on their desk, and they didn't benchmark Bloomberg against Telecourse or Bloomberg against a Thomson Reuters solution. Yes. Bloomberg were there. And we are entering a new phase now into the banking age where bankers, younger bankers, can choose their CRM, they can choose their PMS, they can choose their communication tools. Now, what we can see in Switzerland is that the successful fintech in terms of funding have been fintech more into the B2C world, where the VC have been pouring a lot of money, of course, because their business doesn't need any permission. This is something also I learned as a small startup, it's better to start a product where you don't need too many permissions. A bit the same way you would have a Facebook product or a Tinder. It's so easy to have a Tinder product. It would be lovely to have a Tinder fintech, where you don't need any permission from the security, the compliance, the chief advisory, the chief information officer, the chief banker, etc., etc. But you know this better than me.
Yes, I guess it comes back to this question about this funny/silly word, fintech, which to me seems to mean two quite different things. One of which is new players in financial services, offering financial services either to businesses or to individuals. For example, Zopa or Funding Circle. And then the other is more like sort of tech fins, if you want to switch the word around,
sure,
which is new firms offering new services to existing financial services players, which again is a bit like outsourced innovation. As you say, all banks around the world have got larger and larger and larger, and therefore less and less flexible, and therefore the sort of creativity ends up sort of leaving the bank and starting somewhere else. So in terms of starting your fintech, so you have to be crazy, you have to be passionate, you have to have some vision, you have to, in a sense, be a goat in the first place and not actually to be a very good sheep, and therefore to realize you might as well go and be a goat if you're a goat. So on the podcast in the past, I've had Startup Bootcamp and the Accenture program and spoken to them in London about these programs. How do you see, Alexandre, the whole role of incubators and accelerators in terms of small fintechs and startup fintechs, and when does it work and when doesn't it work?
It's becoming trendy. Probably this is a phenomenon of the Generation Y. You like to have your father and your mother walking along your company and you're progressing with them. Those are incubators. Again, you must make sure that your time will be used in a meaningful way, and often it's difficult to be patient in receiving advice from people that were not previously entrepreneurs or that did not connected whatsoever fintech solutions to a core banking or be successful in delivering a B2C solution to hundreds of thousands of clients. This is not something you can just learn into handbooks, and I'm always very skeptical about different types of boot camps. I participated to start a boot camp in Zurich. It was wonderful. But again, you need more to start a company. And at the beginning, no one believes in you. And you have just to start from the mud. So the good thing is that today we have a lot of APIs. Again, this is a complex subject for Switzerland because APIs, most of them are hosted on Amazon Web Services. So you cannot use them from Switzerland. Otherwise, you would have some cross-border identity issues, particularly into the private banking. This is very important. So as you can imagine, for Swiss FinTech, it's becoming very hard because the legal framework is not really much adapted.
Yes. I mean, on this whole incubator accelerator thing, it was a sort of very big thing. And of course, it's driven from the whole Y Combinator-y, West Coasty kind of social phenomenon almost. And I think one of the interesting things is that after a period of time, in anything, you can start to look at a performance record. And I'm not sure I've actually seen, in terms of the much vaunted transparency in fintech, I'm not sure I've actually seen much of a performance record from, say, the London Startup Bootcamp, the Accenture program, and Barclays, for example. Certainly, I don't, off the top of my head, recall the names of many of them that have been through that program. I think the ones that find it most useful are the ones that are in need of a bit of business education in the first place, perhaps. But maybe a lot of them are just sort of disappearing and, they get some sort of gig with HSBC and they're quite happy and they provide some little piece of software or something like that, rather than emerge as a challenger to Zopa or Funding Circle.
Sure, perhaps. And I share the same concern as you do. Now, again, I think we have to be patient because you never know. There could be a genius in those incubators. But the reality of entrepreneurship is not as simple as pushing a startup, I would say a startup pitch in front of 20 people and then trying to use 2 APIs and release it to the market. I mean, there are so many hurdles to the commercialization of a fintech product. I believe incubator will not solve them as they say they do.
Yes, and after a while, once you're an incubator, you're running the same program for the sort of 15th time, and it has, by definition, become a bit of a cookie cutter, a bit of sort of squares
Sure.
and circles and hoops you need to go through. And if you're a really radical innovator, then you want to do something in a completely crazy way, in a completely different way. So anyway, I think the answer to that is that it seems to me that it's good for some.
That's right.
After we started our fintech, we then go on to the building product. Now, to make it sound incredibly simple, building product is a kind of IT thing, and that's a known world in itself, how to build IT, and it's not that simple building good IT in the first place, but clearly you need to. And as I mentioned before on the podcast, unlike in other tech circles, when you're dealing with people's money and that kind of thing, you can't really have mistakes there.
Well, Investless is my second company, so I made a lot of mistakes during the first one, and definitely I tried not to replicate the same errors. It was tough. I was alone. I was lucky to find smart guys. In fact, I've been lucky to have in my team the first of the promotion of the university and the last one of the promotion. So the first one, we know why, because he's the cleverest guy. He knows everything about everything and is coming from Mars. It's a high IQ. And why the last one? Because he was just smart enough to pass and to get the diploma. So I had the chance to build a very smart team from the beginning. And also I was very lucky that I had the background required in terms of understanding of the business process. And it was easy to get the product tested very, very quickly. I think when you're a small company, the key of success is to make sure that you will be able to test with prospects as soon as possible to get their feedbacks, to enhance user interface and experience.
Yes, going back to the cultural points, of course, in West Coast, just techie San Francisco, it's very good to have failed a few times, as long as you're learning the lessons, we presume, whereas in the UK, it's less so, and I assume that somewhere relatively conservative like Switzerland is still catching on to the idea that failure is a success in a way. So what were the kind of key lessons you learned from your first iteration? You mentioned having a good team around you makes a huge difference.
Having a good team is a big difference. Making sure that the technology you're using is mature enough is also key. Having enough time and cash, because you always run out of cash and always run out of time. And then you have to make sure that you're solving a real problem.
They're really good ones. And I've stopped going to these sort of incubators, open days, and come and hear pitches. I had LinkedIn today says, come and hear an evening of exciting pitches from exciting young fintechs and networking. I thought, oh my God, no. I'd rather just have a bath instead or something like that.
Sure.
Because there are just sort of millions of people out there thinking they're going to change the world and next to nobody does. But I think it was Nigel Verdon was talking about the origins of currency cloud and solving a real problem, which was one he had. And he knew it was a problem that not just he had, other people had it. So, if you start by solving a real problem,
And then you need execution.
And then you need execution, which of course is a very simple thing, isn't it? Not.
Yeah, it seems simple at the beginning, but then you start talking to your partners because you need servers, you need feeds, you have a lot of parties with who you're playing with, and they are not as responsive as you thought. They don't have sandbox as you thought, and then things are really, really complex. So you need a lot of resilience to start a fintech company.
Yes, and as you were saying about everything takes longer than you think. I mean, most businesses that go bust are actually making a profit. They just suffer from cash flow. And certainly in terms of the sort of medium to smaller fintechs that I speak to in London who haven't been on the show, speaking to a lot of those, and actually there's some that have been on the show, of course everybody finds that everything takes far longer than you think, which actually of course translates back to money. You need more fuel for a longer journey. And again, this can be a challenge of going back and just raising more and more money, and how to do that without sort of destroying and wasting 6 months of your life and 6 months of the company's progress is another challenge that I think small fintechs and medium fintechs have to face.
Sure, and small fintech can also become zombies because, if you fail to execute as well as you thought, but you still have cash or you still think you have time, then what? At the end, you need to deliver. You need to expand your team. You need to change from the V1 to the V2, then the V3. You need to upscale your servers and your technologies. You must make sure you won't turn into a zombie when you're a small company.
Yes, I think this is not a cultural difference. This is an age difference, because given when I grew up, there were still sort of Spitfires flying over the sky and all that kind of stuff at air displays. When you say things like V1 and V2, I immediately think of the sort of German rockets that were being sent over towards the UK, and I was wondering what the V3 was before I realised actually you meant 1.0, 2.0 or 3.0 in my language.
Just to tell you about the Spitfire, Mike, for me the Spitfire is what you put into your glass.
Ah, okay. Well, actually there is a Spitfire beer I've drank around here.
That's right.
Well. A very nice one it is too. So coming on to this point about getting bigger and growing, we then come into the whole sort of area of marketing and selling and operational stuff. And the first point that always strikes my mind is that in the modern world there's an excess of almost everything, certainly an excess of information and an excess of companies. And I once wrote a blog post called 10 fingers, 10 toes, one attention, oh dear, and everybody only has one attention, and it's quite hard to get the attention of people. And I know that you're very good at this, because when you came to that huge sort of more tech fin conference in the Alexandre, you and your colleagues had red hoodies which made you stand out a mile from the other boring dressed people. So you're obviously an expert in getting attention. But this is again one of the things that I've seen small fintechs underappreciate, which is that in a busy world you've got to get someone's attention and time, and they ain't got much of it because their day is already too full in the first place.
Sure, and I can tell you that I've seen a big evolution in the past 18 months. I would say that 18 months ago, the communication was very much erotic. What I mean by that is that each word has a sense, has a meaning. It was impactful. People knew what they were talking about. People talking about Bitcoin payments, SEPA, PSD, or MiFID II would know what they're talking about.
Just pausing on that one, I think we have a different version of eroticism, but some people may find Bitcoin payments erotic.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the way you communicate. I think today it shifted very much from erotism to pornographic.
Okay.
And shifting from erotism to pornographic is clearly a big issue for small companies, because it's difficult to have enough people, enough money to be present at all those exhibitions, to be present at on the newspapers, on the radio, and follow up all this huge quantity of media around the fintech.
Yes, well, maybe mixing your very French take on the sort of pornography and eroticism, which sounds like a much more interesting episode of the London Fintech podcast. Maybe I should have one a month, which is a subscription one, you see. You've got to pay $100 for this one. It talks about something more like that. I rather liked a presentation that you made in Switzerland recently, which you kindly shared with me, for young fintechs, and it was very briefly going over sort of definitions of marketing, telemarketing, public relations, advertising, graphic design and branding, and comparing what they were in a little graphic. And the marketing was a guy telling a woman, I'm a great lover. The telemarketing was a guy telling a woman, I'm a great lover, over the phone. Public relations was interesting as a picture of another woman telling the woman, trust me, he's a great lover. Advertising I quite liked was this bloke saying, I'm a great lover, I'm a great lover, I'm a great lover. Graphic design, the guy's just looking at the woman, he's got a heart above his head. And then I thought what was really very strong, and actually I've crossed this line myself around about Christmas, was branding, which is, I understand you're a great lover, says the woman to the man. And I mentioned that as last night I went to some actually real estate dinner, and someone came up to me and said, oh, I've heard of the podcast. That's much easier than me telling you about it, because if I tell you, you're not going to believe me anyway. But if you come up and tell me it's wonderful, I'm probably inclined to agree.
This is also a reason why we started all those meetups. It was to help our colleagues to foster their communication skills and to make sure they will communicate to the right people with the right message. Because when you're an entrepreneur, you're in your garage, you're shy. Most of them are passionate people. They are not born marketers, and this is also a reason why we started those meetups, to help them, offer them a tribune and a place to exchange ideas with competitors and also prospects.
Yes, so assuming that you've then got attention for your fintech and you've managed, fortunately, to get sort of some clients going, the next big problem can be that one day your business really takes off, and all fintechs from small, medium to large are seeing this challenge that you might think you want success, but be careful what you wish for, you might actually get it. Because when you get success, you can suddenly find that you get 10, 100 times the clients, and then your infrastructure starts creaking, and that's a really very difficult challenge. I mean, how do you see this in your experience?
In my experience, you must be very humble. When it's becoming a real success, you must be humble because you can't be good at everything. And when it's getting bigger, you have to delegate. And delegating to your employees is something that is not so easy when it's your baby. And that's, I think, is the first challenge when your company goes from 10 to 50, 100 employees. After, it's another problem. I think growing from 10 to 50, you must make sure that you won't have a nervous breakdown and you will be delegating enough to the right people. And also startups are becoming more international, so you have also the time zone effect, language effect also. So it's things you have to manage when you really get bigger.
Yes, as well as the infrastructure and whether your database is big enough or you need to sort of upscale and that. I mean, I was thinking that there's a room for a whole series of books mentioning your numbers. I mean, I bought a book a while ago, 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, who I think was one of the founders of PayPal or something like that. And that talks about really the whole creativity of going from a blank sheet of paper to something. But then, there really is a room for another book based on your experience going from sort of 1 to 10. You did the 0 to 1 before, and you found that actually you then need to go beyond the 1 to 10. And then, of course, there's another book called 10 to 50, and then 50 onwards, and including after I left Kleinwort Benson Dresner, as it was then, going from 50,000 to 250,000.
I read the 0 to 1. I preferred, because maybe this is my generation, the Lego generation, I prefer the mass customization concepts of Joe Pines. It can be from 0 to 1, but 1 to 10, then back to 10 to 8, and modular your business depending on what you're offering to whom. And those type of mass customization models are really much, I think, the models of the fintech.
So give me an example. I'm not familiar with this sort of 1 to 10 and then 10 to 8.
Sure. What is mass customization is that you build a company which is versatile enough to get connected to different types of business when the clients need them. A bit like a SaaS solution, but based on a Heroku or based on a cloud where you could opt in for apps depending on the client's needs instead of charging everything upfront. And for a startup, this is very important because you never know exactly where the regulation is going to bring you. And being flexible in terms of code, flexible in terms of apps is one of the key of the success of small companies, I think.
And the 10 to 8? But
then the 10 to 8 is because sometimes the time to market can be longer than what you thought. So you have to reduce your team, and sometimes you have to reduce also some of the clients where the churning is too important. So you have to, unfortunately, sometimes say to clients, well, guys, it's too expensive to have you with all your specificities.
I think I was one of the first people ever in investment management to sack a client, private client, and I just decided he was just too time-consuming and there's better things to do than that, which is very shocking. So in the early days when I was in financial services, there was no idea of pruning your clients, but pruning is a very important thing. I mean, the other thing that, of course, happens in tech in general is that at the beginning, you're desperate to get a client, and then when you've got 1, you want 2, and you want 3. As you say, for the sake of argument, when you've got 10, you start realizing that actually, some of them really want so many customizations, they're just taking off your sort of core path going forwards, and therefore right. You need to sort of avoid those distractions and say, look, that's a really valid thing to want, but you know what? We don't actually do that. We do fish and chips, and we don't do peas or whatever it is.
Yes, I think it's very important that your clients understand what you're doing, and as a small company, you always want to say yes. You're so excited. But then sometimes you have to say no, and we are only doing one single thing, The best example is with Inves Glass, our product. People think that we can do trading and they want to do a lot of other stuff that we don't do. And I just tell them that, guys, it's just an engagement tool.
Exactly. So moving on to InvestGlass, going back to the fact that you've given talks on how to be clear and simple and all that kind of stuff, and going back to the basics of that. So what problem exists in the world, Alexandre, that you're solving, and what's your solution?
So InvestGlass is an engagement tool, and we are solving the issue of relevancy and compliance.
For whom?
You're a banker, you're an advisor, you are going to call a prospect, and you want to make sure that the investment conviction your head of sales is pushing you are going to be compliant and convincing to your prospect. It's a bit like a CRM linked to an information portal, which will help you to engage each client individually.
Last week I was at the Alternative Investment Seminar in London, which is a very interesting one run by Intelligent Partnership, chaired by David Stevenson. And this is a whole bunch of IFAs in a room, I don't know, 50 or 100, I'm not very good at guessing numbers of people, independent financial advisors, and their job is to give advice to members of the public and how to invest and all that kind of thing. And they, like most people in the world, have been hit by a tsunami of regulation and legislation and all the stuff they must do and all that kind of thing. So the old-fashioned kind of just giving good advice really doesn't work anymore. So I can see that there is a huge need in the world for that kind of thing. I can equally see that not all of them know it because people have been doing things in a very traditional way for a very long time. And then, of course, one's got the challenge of finding the right business model and the right price points. And if you're doing it cheaply, how to sell 1 million. And if you're doing it expensively, how to sell a few at high price.
Sure. With rates as low as we know now, and with markets that are quite difficult to make alpha performance from, I believe that individualizing and creating added value with a smart investment proposal, with a good storytelling, is always the right way to go. Of course, if the markets are going up, well, everyone is happy. But when markets are going down, then you better have a good storytelling automatic machine to make sure that what you're going to say is going to be smart and compliant.
Yes, I mean, it's a kind of two things you're talking about there. On the one hand, talking about the Gen Y and the younger folks, they're used to having apps for everything on their phone and all that kind of thing. So it would seem inconceivable perhaps to them to actually go into some meeting without some app or some information well presented to you to help you do your job well. Equally, those that have been around for a long time soon learn that, compliance
Sure.
and no breaking all these regulations is a sine qua non. And that's one of the reasons that I think many fintechs I've seen in London have failed, because they've had what you call this sort of West Coast attitude. Oh, let's just carry on and worry about the regulation later. No, not in financial services. I'm sorry. It used to be like that, but you can't now.
Sure, and I will tell you something that might shock you, but I think, Mike, you, like my mother, you're Generation Y. You're Generation Y. You're just a different type of Generation Y, but you are Generation Y. My mother is using more automatization and tablets and automatic tools that probably I do. So I think the Generation Y, it can be seen as you, as me. It's just the way you are using and dealing with all those new digital tools.
No, that's very true. One of the podcasts that I listen to most of the episodes of is The Marketing Companion with Tom Webster and Mark Schaefer from the States. Business development is one of my interests, along with risk and financial services and things like that. And I've downloaded currently, but I haven't listened to, an episode called Are Marketing Personas Still Relevant? And I've always been, I've been more at the B2B end in terms of marketing and selling and growing businesses, which is very different from the B2C stuff. But I've always been extremely skeptical of this whole sort of marketing persona stuff, of pigeonholing people based on sort of race, religion, age, or anything really, because as you say, there are people of any age who are interested in technology, and equally the people of any age who try and avoid it. So
Sure.
My elder daughter, who's 18, just tries to use her smartphone as little as possible. My younger daughter, who's 16 and a half, she's on it all the time. So it really isn't segmented by gender or age or anything like that, but it's kind of the mentality. So where's the future of InvestGlass then? I mean, if you had a looking glass, for InvestGlass, and if I was your fairy godmother and I could wave some magic wands, what would you be wanting for the next year of InvestGlass? Would you be looking for some big partner who can solve this sort of the last mile problem of how you can connect your useful product to 1,000 or 10,000 customers out there, or are you still working out ways to go and knock on 10,000 doors, as it were, metaphorically speaking?
Some way between the two. We believe that the future is bright for InvestGlass, as we believe that this type of tool of digitalization will be key for most banks to create added value. Again, when you have a new product that's a bit disruptive, it's always difficult to explain in simple words where the value added will be shifted to. But I believe that more and more bankers, brokers will engage each client differently with unique storytelling. And I know that the UK is very welcoming for InvestGlass. I'm still a bit stubborn and I'm trying to convince my ex-colleagues to get InvestGlass onboarded on their desks. So we'll see for the short-term future of InvestGlass in Switzerland, and who knows, probably we'll be with an office soon in London.
Good luck in all that. I think one of the lessons you mentioned there is one that I sort of learnt myself many times through my career, which is that often at school or in business textbooks or whatever, the idea is that you're right and you spot the gap in the market and all that kind of stuff. But good luck to you if you do, because what you don't want to be is right but early. If you do the right thing but 5 years before everyone else, it's a hell of a job being an evangelical salesman, going around because you're having to evangelize for your whole concept firstly, before then people say, oh, why choose your specific product around that? But equally, if you're ahead of the game and you've got the stamina to last, then it'll hold you in good stead. It's all about timing, I guess, isn't it?
And also being a good painkiller.
A painkiller in which way?
Well, you're talking about stamina. I think a good fintech must be, of course, a vitamin. It should enhance the process of classical banks, but it should be also a painkiller in solving the new regulation hurdles that are going to arrive, particularly with the MiFID II regulations coming in Europe.
I see. Yes, it's an interesting one. Well, using your vitamins and painkiller approach, the evangelical selling can be very much like trying to sell vitamins. So I try and persuade you to take this multivitamin because if you keep taking it for months, you'll feel better. That's quite a tough sell, as opposed to I say, look, have you got a headache? Yeah, I have. It's really digging my head in. I've got these painkillers. They will take headache away now. So people are really incentivized to buy headache tablets, but it's really hard to incentivize them to buy vitamins. Well, I think that's a useful note to wrap up on. Time's gone by fast, as always, and I think it's very admirable, as I say at the outset, that you're doing the Swiss fintech stuff. I know painfully myself that one can spend a lot of time helping a lot of people and it doesn't necessarily create a business model in itself, but it does help create a community and create a sector. In terms of the small and startup fintechs, I'm full of admiration for people that turn down the apparent security of large organizations to go out and actually try and change the world in small or bigger ways and self-actualize and be goats and release their creativity and make the whole world a better place if everyone tries to use their creativity. And having seen InvestGlass people around, I know that you're very good folks, very good solid product you've got here, and I hope you get every success in the future, and in a year's time you're coming to tell us about the journey from 1 to 10 or 1 to 50, or was it 5 to 50 people?
Sure, and I return the invitation. Please join us in Geneva or in Zurich. If you are in those cities, I'll make sure you have a good time and you will enjoy also the fantastic Swiss cheese fondue that we have in our country.
Excellent. That sounds brilliant, especially if it's skiing season.
Ski and fondue.
Skiing fondue, and especially if there's a sort of private jet flown in. I'm very cheap, really. Okay, good luck with all that, Alexandre, and thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on iTunes or your podcast app, or sign up at londonfintechpodcast.com for email alerts on new episodes. Live long and prosper.
We could sit in a bender all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moonrise, watching a happy moonrise. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me, 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 watch the firelight dance.